Everyone. Very happy you all could join us for the second module in the refresher series. Like it was last week, we will go through the slides and then have a chance to talk and have questions. So currently all participants are muted. There will be time for discussion and questions at the end. If we don't have time, we'll follow up as best we can. This session is recorded and the presentation will be shared on our website. Connie's from last week is already up there, so that's good. Really, the purpose of this series is to review critical concepts, but also to just give folks that are getting ready to train a refresher of what's going on. These webinars resulted from people asking us if they could attend some of the trainings we were having just to get a refresher. So it really is focused at PSA trainers and lead trainers, right? So that's who this is. You may not be a trainer, which is okay if you're here too. So we welcome everyone. The important part is that attending these office hours or watching these recordings does not count as attending a PSA Train the Trainer or Grower Training Course. Nor will you earn a PSA AFDO certificate of completion. And again, for those of you that are already PSA trainers or lead trainers, not an issue. If you're new to food safety and you're attending these to see if you're interested, that's great. But to become a trainer, you need to attend the PSA Train the Trainer, which we have done one pilot remotely. So those will be more available. The PSA Grower Training slides are copyrighted and may not be published electronically without express permission of Cornell University, nor sold in whole or in part by a third party or company for profit. So if you want to take this slide presentation and sell it to somebody, you can't. That's what that means. All right, I was tasked with module 2. I should introduce myself. My name is Betsy Bihn. I'm the director of the Produce Safety Alliance. I've been at Cornell University for about 21 years, working with farmers to implement food safety practices on the farm. I personally love module 2. And one of the reasons I love the worker health, hygiene, and training module is because, in my opinion, it is the best time and money investment for risk reduction. And that's a bold statement, but I'm going to go with it. I also think it's the best way to build a food safety culture on the farm. Both of these are very, very important to food safety. And the reason I think it's the best time and money investment, as a little bit of defense of that statement, is that food safety really requires that everyone who's involved in the production of fresh produce understand concepts of food safety, understands microbial risks and how to reduce them. Not everybody needs to be a microbiologist, but people need to know how their job impacts food safety. If you have that level of knowledge on your farm, it is much easier to implement a food safety program that is effective. So that's why I think training is important. And this idea of building a food safety culture is critical to that. Everybody has to understand food safety as a priority. So that's my defense of that statement. The other thing is we have data that shows us that on these on-farm readiness reviews, and this is compliments of my colleague Meredith Melendez at Rutgers, when they're out doing on-farm readiness reviews, they are seeing that these issues come up related to health and hygiene: inadequate visitor notification of health and hygiene requirements, inadequate or missing records of worker hygiene training, inadequate worker hygiene training, inadequate toilet and hand washing facilities. All of these things we're going to talk about in this module. And since these are showing up on farm readiness reviews, we know that there is still a lot of work to be done in this area. So another very important reason. I want to pause here and say this. At the beginning of a training, it is common that we go around the room and let people introduce themselves, and they will say why they're there or what their concerns are. That information is critical to this module because it allows you to highlight the things in the module that are relevant to your audience. As with all of the PSA modules, they are very content dense. So keeping track of who's in your audience and the things that are important to them will allow you to move through this module fluidly, okay, without being forced into reading every slide. And that's what the goal really is for today. So like all modules, it begins with the learning objectives. Connie mentioned this last week. Sometimes the learning objectives can be pretty robust, if you will. One of the things I've done is I've put motion into my learning objectives, and I also highlight the parts that I want to draw people's attention to, right? So we're going to identify potential routes of contamination associated with workers. We're going to identify some learning concepts, right? When you're training people, things that are important. Describe topics that must. You can see here that I also colorize musts and shoulds. But what you want to tell them is you want to be able to work through the learning objectives without reading the slide if you can, right? Highlighting those things that are important. Describe how to monitor your facilities, making sure everybody gets trained and that they're doing the right things. Describe corrective actions that can be taken when your policies aren't followed or your facilities aren't maintained. And identify records and record keeping tools that are used for both monitoring and managing worker health and hygiene. The important thing I want to stress here is you will notice that the module flow shows up in the learning objectives. Again, Connie discussed this last week. It's a great place to reinforce why that flow is built into these modules. There's a lot of content. You want to help the learner manage all of the content they're getting and getting people into that habit of starting with risk assessment, which is what this slide is, and then moving through implementation of practices, monitoring, all of those processes, corrective actions, and record keeping will help them apply the information they've learned and implement it at the farm level. Again, this is risk assessment, talking about humans carrying human pathogens, talking about importance of training. Very important to people who do not understand why worker training is so critical. This routes of contamination is a great slide, especially if you have somebody in the audience, for instance, who has animals on the farm, as the man walking through the chickens demonstrates. You can talk about how contamination can spread from one part of the farm to the other. This is just a great opportunity to highlight things that are relevant to people in your audience. These next 4 slides really talk about the importance of worker training, and they're more based on sort of soft skill things that growers need to know. They really do start to help the grower focus on why empowering workers and training workers is critical to food safety, right? So starts off with that first bullet of hitting it straight on. Fresh produce is often consumed fresh. There's no kill step, right? So getting your workers to implement practices reduces the risks that are out there and starts to move you in the direction of a food safety culture for your farm. This slide is really an opportunity to draw the growers in and help them understand what are training challenges they might face on their farms. It won't be relevant for all of these, won't be relevant for everybody in the training, but if you have folks from a different country who speak a different language or literacy issues, this is a great opportunity to highlight some of those things. Under the bullet that says variation in hygiene practices and expectations, that's really in there for things like the toilet paper problem, right? Where farms have toilet paper that does not end up in the toilet because the workers are from areas where the plumbing is bad, so they put the toilet paper next to the toilet or in the garbage can. But it is a great opportunity to highlight things that they might see as challenges and get them thinking about how am I going to implement these practices on my farm. This next slide is optional, and I have created, I turn the optional slides orange for learning purposes so that you guys know this is an optional slide. The important part about principles of adult learning as a slide is knowing who is in your audience. If you have larger farmers who already have established worker training programs and they've been through this a lot, this may not be the most important slide. But if you have people that really have not started implementing a food safety program on their farm and don't have training as a priority, then using this slide might be very valuable. So you got to make the decision based on who you know is going to be in the room. This slide I love. I'll say this, communication is key to food safety. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, communication is key to a lot of things. So if you want to linger on this slide, that is okay. And I typically do, because to me, this is really an important concept that needs to be conveyed. Workers will only do what they know they're supposed to do. Empowering them to communicate back to their managers, to the farm owner, if they see a problem, is critical. If they see a problem and they tell somebody about it and nothing happens to resolve the issue, you have lost valuable ground in implementing a food safety plan. So I think this slide is very important. This next slide, everyone needs training. You'll notice needs isn't a must or a should, but you'll notice in the corner there that this is a slide that has regulatory information in there. And the balance we're striking here is that the rule says that those that handle produce or touch food contact surfaces must be trained. But we're arguing in this slide that everyone needs to be trained on the farm because everybody interacts with each other. And if everybody's not involved in food safety, you're gonna have kinks in your armor, if you will. And so you wanna make sure that everyone is trained. But that's why we're treading that needs word right there. Visitors. Okay, very, very important that they know this. You have got to get the growers on board with these two requirements for visitors. You have to make them aware of the farm's food safety policies, and you have to provide access to toilet and hand washing facilities. Only two things, but they really need to know these. This other key information you'll see is a should. Also very important if they're trying to manage people on the farm. But I really want to draw home your eyes to that top part, which is that you got to make sure the growers know these two requirements and help them think through how they're going to do that on their farm. These next set of slides are really talking about what training programs must include. And some of them are a bit nebulous, right? They're not as specific as maybe they could be in telling you what exactly you have to tell them about food hygiene and food safety. So with these next couple of slides, I like to move through them and really highlight the things that are specific. So growers know, okay, if I'm building a farm food safety training program, what are the things I have to include explicitly, right? Which are those key things that have to be mentioned? You can see here, be appropriate for the job and conducted upon hiring. That's pretty clear. You have to do it when you're hiring them, including a refresher training at least annually. Those are important things to understand. Be easily understood, be supervised by a qualified person. Might have trouble deciding what a qualified person looks like, so you might want to guide them through that, somebody who has a food safety experience. And include a process for documenting the training. That is very important. The document of training your workers will show up in module after module in this PSA training. This is another one that's a little broad. Workers must and supervisors must be qualified to conduct the job duties, education, training, and experience. Well, hopefully if you're hiring them, they're qualified with education, training, and experience. Okay. Here, this is what I really want to stop on for a little bit and talk about these specific things, right? Evaluate contamination risk before and during harvest. This is why worker training is important, because they're out there doing the harvest. Significant animal activity. What does that mean? Does that mean one set of prints, two sets of prints? Does it mean a specific animal? You've got to help your workers think through these things. Presence of fecal matter is pretty clear. Damaged crops, extensive animal tracks. The second bullet, never harvest produce destined for the fresh market that is visibly contaminated with feces. Driving that point home is very important. Now, we live in upstate New York. People harvest apples. They're pulling apples off a tree over their head sometimes where they can't see the entire apple. People aren't looking at every apple. So there's going to be things that get missed. But the important thing is that if they see it has fecal material on it or poop on it, they really need to not harvest it. Never harvest dropped produce. There's a lot of discussion about what is the definition of dropped produce. So you may want to help people recognize that by going over the definition of dropped produce and only using clean harvest packing containers. So you want to talk about how do you make harvest containers clean, right? What kind of sanitation program is that? This next question, for those of you that were not on last week, these are clicker questions that were designed. There's clicker questions for every module for back when we could use clickers in in-person training. But we've also learned how to modify them so that people can use Annotate. If any of you are familiar with Annotate, if you go to the top of your screen, there is an area where you can drop down, and Annotate is one of the options. So you'll see the Annotate, and then you can write right on the slide by picking a stamp. So I would like you guys to see if you can do Annotate and pick one of these. Which of the following is considered dropped covered produce? I like the person who's, you want me to make a smiley face up here too? Almonds shaken onto the ground during machine harvest, cucumbers that fall from trellised vines, collards that are harvested, bundled, and then laid on top of plants for infield packing, or watermelons growing on the soil. Well, we clearly have a smarty pants group today because you guys are all getting it right in all your Annotate loveliness. Yeah, you're right. Cucumbers that fall from the trellised vines. Why? Because there's a likelihood that damage could result, and that makes it more susceptible to contamination by pathogens. Almonds, that's a typical harvest process. Collards that are harvested, again, a typical process for those crops. And watermelons growing on the soil. So you're allowed to have produce growing on the ground, but if it is meant to be growing off of the ground and falls to the ground, that is dropped covered produce. Thank you. I'm going to clear and move on. Oh, good. Somebody cleared for me. Thank you. All right, we come to another optional slide. I like using this slide because I like to talk about some of the science that tells us if we move signs around periodically, they draw people's attention. So you can have the same poster up year after year after year, but if you move it around, you tend to get people's attention again. So if there are concepts you want to reinforce, posters are a great way to do it. It's also good that if you find a problem, address the problem. Those little 5 or 10-minute morning sessions where you get everybody together to highlight something is oftentimes more effective than an hour-long training where you drone on and people get lost or lose their attention. So I like this slide. I like it because it talks about the importance of training, and it gives growers ideas, again, of how to make training impactful on their farms. Resources provided to support food safety practices. All of these are important. I have in the past gone through and colored them for the ones that are explicitly required by the rule versus the ones that aren't explicitly required, and talk about the difference and why they're all important. You can choose to do that or not, but that's how I've used this slide in the past. Toilet and hand washing facilities. I go through these fairly quickly, but you want to make sure people know what they have to provide. As you will remember from the OFRR data, one of the things that shows up is that facilities aren't available, or they're not clean, or they're not stocked. So talking about this slide is important. Drinking and break areas. This one, depending on the size of your audience, will generate, or the people in your audience will generate a lot of discussion. Some growers don't have a specific space that is easy to designate. So we talk about how do you designate an area, how do you get people to stay in the designated area, the importance of providing a hand washing station so after you take a break, you can wash your hands. Again, this to me is very dependent on the audience. Training versus practices. Okay, this is where we convert over from what was in the first part when I was telling you these are things that you have to include in a training versus these are behaviors that the workers have to exhibit in their practices. And it's important to understand this transition is happening because there are certain practices that aren't necessarily covered in what needs to be covered in training. And so you need to make sure you do train on those things. okay? Even if it isn't explicitly required, it's important to include them. And you need to realize that. There's also an opportunity right here to stop and go over some of those key things that we just talked about. What did we just talk about? What key things are required? And give the audience a chance to engage. You're also about 20 slides into this presentation, right? So you're maybe halfway through, and it's a great break for them to give you feedback, to provide things like what's required of visitors, and for them to recent their attention before you move into the next part of the presentation. Okay, so now we're talking about workers, what they have to do. Maintaining personal cleanliness. What does that mean? Does that mean that they're required to wear clean clothes to work? If those things are part of the farm food safety plan, they need to be shared with the workers in that training that we just talked about. Avoiding contact with animals, all of these things, if you wear gloves. So I go over these individually and try and highlight where they impact the growers. This is always a good one. If people are confused about when they need to wash their hands, this is a great one. Doesn't usually take a lot of time, but important. Proper hand washing. Love this slide. Oftentimes we'll make people, when we're in person, we'll make people actually rub their hands together for 20 seconds while I time them. It's an easy thing you can do. The important thing is when you're timing them is to, in my opinion, to be quiet and to not say anything. So tell them, I'm gonna set my watch for 20 seconds, start. And then in silence, wait for 20 seconds and then say, you're done. It really instills how long that period is. Afterwards, you can talk about singing or ways to make it go faster in your mind, but it really drives home that idea of 20 seconds. You can also use glow germ. I know Donna has done some glow germ stuff in remote trainings, also a good thing to do, but there are simple things you can do to engage people that don't require really interrupting this flow. And we oftentimes can run over in this module. So you have to think about that if you're adding anything, how is that time gonna come out in the end? All right, proper use of toilets. If you had anybody who started and told you they had the toilet paper problem, this is a good place to talk about that. The importance of helping people who are from areas that don't have good plumbing understand why it needs to go in the toilet, and those important concepts. We do have a poster for this that you could add to your slide presentation here, but very important to help people think through it. Worker clothing, again, this is just talking about what it means to have good hygiene, good personal hygiene, things that will reduce risks. The second one, again, if you have anybody who has animals on the farm, you may want to talk about the footwear issues. Or if they happen to live on an animal farm but work on a produce farm, that's another thing that you might want to talk about. Worker illness, this is just understanding what communicable diseases and concerns look like. You have somebody with nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever. You don't want them handling fresh produce. So help people think through, how do I tell? If there's a worker that goes to the bathroom a lot, more than normal, maybe I need to have a discussion about what they're experiencing and move them away from either handling fresh produce or food contact surfaces. Worker injury, you'll notice here that there is not a provision symbol in the corner, but this is very important. Making sure first aid kits are available, making sure they're in convenient locations, helping people understand if they cut themselves on the hand and blood gets on product, how to get rid of the product, how to wash their hand, wash the wound, bandage it, and then double glove it. So they're protecting themselves and they're protecting the produce that they handle, okay? So helping people think through that is critical, and it really needs to be included in your worker training program. Now we move on to monitoring. We've talked a lot about the practices that need to be done, and here's where we transition back to that normal flow. What are things that need monitored, right? We need to make sure workers are following food safety practices. We need to make sure facilities are available, clean, well stocked. These are things that growers need to think about. How am I going to implement that on my farm? And there's some suggestions, right? You can train your supervisors to observe their behavior. You can appoint someone to check facilities every day. And implementing monitoring logs is a great way to see that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and to know, okay, the toilet was checked this morning and everything was fine, but by this afternoon we have trouble, right? So it helps you establish time periods for replenishing supplies or other things. That's why monitoring logs are quite handy. Corrective actions, right? We did risk assessment, practices implementation, monitoring. Now we're at corrective actions. What are some things that you can see coming, right? You can see coming that you might have a worker that does not wash their hands like they're supposed to. Okay, so you need to think through, what are going to be my corrective actions? This is the place where we like to talk about carrots and sticks, right? A carrot motivates somebody. A stick punishes them for not doing the right thing. And I've seen both of these work on farms. In the carrot category, acknowledging verbally that somebody's doing the right thing is actually very effective. I've seen growers do candy bars. I've seen them do hats. I've seen them do other farm bling to recognize people that are doing and following policies the way they were intended to be followed. I've also seen farmers, use the stick. The one example that always rings in my head is the grower told the workers, the next time I see somebody not wash their hands, they go home for the rest of the day. In the middle of harvest, especially if you're a piece rate worker, that's a lot of money. And the grower had to send exactly one person home to drive that concept across the entire workforce. Okay, so I like carrots more than sticks, but the growers have to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it on their farm. Facilities not being cleaned or restocked, that often depends on if you're doing it yourself or you're working with a sanitation company, and how to manage the sanitation company and get the sanitation company to do what's in their contract is important. If you're doing it on farm, it might require retraining workers. The other thing is, you can see this tipped over portable toilet. I've heard people say, oh, I've never seen that happen. I have definitely seen that happen. And so if you have portable toilets and you live in a windy area, you should have a plan for that. Record keeping, very, very important, especially for this module. Training your workers really does come up in many other modules that you're going to see in the PSA curriculum. So documenting your worker training programs, those kind of things are just absolutely critical and required by the rule. Monitoring and restocking of facilities, again, those kind of records really help you or the farmer understand how their program's going. And so you need to encourage them to do these things because it gives them a level of granularity in reviewing their food safety plan and getting it established properly. These are two optional slides coming up. The important point here is, if you have farms that are new at record keeping, they need to be aware that there are templates that they can use. They don't have to build everything from scratch, and they need to know that help is out there and resources are out there. So that's why I like talking about these two slides if it comes up. This slide is good because it gives you an idea of what information needs to be on that record keeping sheet. Okay, and very important. Also very important to consider the notes here. And I'm gonna flip here right to that part because you want to help people understand what's required. And in the notes, it's a good place to pause and say, look at subpart O, right? It's in your notes. This is the information you need to record. I also want to mention that the PSA has a required records document that has been very helpful for some folks. many growers have been through a third-party audit and they're already keeping copious amounts of records. Some of them are not aware of the records that are required for the rule versus those that are required for an audit. So this document is good for growers who are just starting out, but it's also good for growers that have had third-party audits and are not sure which ones are required by the rule. Okay, so that's why I like that document. I'm pretty sure Connie or somebody was going to put the link in the chat box. So I'm just going to assume that happened. This is the summary slide. Again, you can see here that I highlight shoulds and musts in blue or red. A great place to go over these individual things and ask the participants what they learned in this module, right? Worker health and hygiene is critical to food safety because workers can introduce food safety risks. It might be good here to ask them, what are some pathogens that are associated with people, right? What are some, why are they a risk? What makes worker hygiene so important to fresh produce, right? That it's eaten raw. It's a great place to bring up what you taught earlier and to get them to engage in that information one more time. This everyone should be trained, right? What is required of the rule versus what do you do if you want to build a culture across your whole farm, right? If you want to build that food safety culture, you really want to engage everyone on the farm so everybody's working in the direction of food safety. Visitors policy, what do they need to know? Great to highlight those two things again. And talking about how training needs to emphasize health and hygiene practices that reduce risks. So another great place to ask them, what are those practices that reduce risks, right? Hand washing, wearing clean clothes, changing your boots, being aware of if there are animals on the farm, all of those things. And lastly, talking about the value of developing a written training program in that it helps you understand what information you're conveying. If you have a problem, you can look at that information and say, oh, I need to add this. And then it gives you that feeling that you're consistently training everyone across the farm. Again, everybody has to be trained upon hiring, and there has to be an update once a year. So you want to make sure that information is solid and that they're giving that consistent information to everybody on the farm for proper implementation. And with that, Connie, I am done. Here's our website, which is the last slide where we're going to post all of these recordings, also in Spanish for those of you that are bilingual or want to share it with colleagues who are Spanish speakers. And I think we can stop recording.
All right, and just the last thing I want to add is that if you are watching this recording and you have any questions, please visit our website and click on Contact Us to find your regional extension associate or one of our Spanish language extension associates. That will give you our phone numbers and our email addresses so that you can contact us with questions.